Okay, so we're often told about herd immunity. And you might be familiar with that term. Are you familiar? Okay, so that's basically saying that you're irresponsible if you don't vaccinate yourself or your child because you're putting other people at risk. Well, there's a few problems with that theory. One is that if people trust their vaccines, they shouldn't be worried about what you're doing. But even more problematic to me is the more I understand about vaccines, the more I understand that so many of the people that are vaccinated are actually developing the disease and then infecting other people, oftentimes shortly after they're vaccinated. You know, I used to think this didn't happen, but just recently I came across an article about cases in Croatia where these children were vaccinated for measles, mumps, rubella, and about a week after the vaccination they developed measles and infected other people. And the article said that in the past they would have never made the link that it was vaccine strain causing the infections, because they would have either called it another disease because the child was vaccinated, or they would have thought it was a wild vaccine, virus, not from the vaccine. But now that we have the ability to test, is it vaccine strain or is it wild, we're seeing that these vaccines can and do infect after these people are vaccinated. We know it happens with rotavirus, the swallowed virus that are given to infants, and we know that it happens with oral polio vaccines. We know it happens with measles, and it's always known it's happened with rubella. So when people want to use this herd immunity argument, it's really not very rational. And this concept of herd immunity really came from a time when people were not vaccinating. There was a doctor who looked at the populations, and he noticed that when 95% of the population of children below 15 had had measles, that epidemics were at a very low rate. And when that changed, when that dropped, then they would see some outbreaks. But it wasn't that people were dying left, right, and center, because as we know, the death rate went down not as a result of vaccination. So this concept of herd immunity does really not apply to vaccination for several reasons. One, I already told you, the vaccines can spread disease. But two, because if we just take measles, for instance, anybody here over the age of 70? Did you have measles growing up?
Yes.
And how was that for you?
Well, I had measles, and I've read the notes my mother made at that time.
Okay.
And she wrote, we had measles, and she wasn't too bad. And I called she called her friend to bring her daughter to me, so she could catch measles as well. That's what mothers did at that time.
Measles parties, because they wanted to get it over with. Yeah.
My mother's friend was a nurse.
Yeah.
Very, very sensible nurse, and she brought cod liver on.
Thank you. I did not plant her in the audience. I want everybody to know that. But I know that there's always somebody over 70 in my audience, and they always say that same thing. Did you know anybody that went blind from measles?
No.
Did anybody you know went blind from measles?
Never.
Did you know of anybody who died from measles? Okay. All right, we're so far 100% on these questions. Cod liver oil has vitamin A, and it's been known about since the 1940s that that is key to recovery from measles, because for whatever reason, the measles virus makes the body consume enormous amounts of vitamin A. And without that, that's when you get this problem with the eyes. And the medical authorities used to say, what did they tell you? Just keep you in a dark room. But that's no cure for blindness or for photophobia. You have to treat the disease, not just put them in a dark room. So the vitamin A was very important. And today we now know that 400,000 units a day to someone who has measles makes a huge difference in the recovery time and in the rate of secondary infections. The other thing is that people were wanting their children to be infected with measles because they wanted to get it over with. It was a mild disease of limited duration. Our health authorities knew that and wrote about that before the vaccine was invented. But today, young people, I mean, can you imagine having your 1-year-old infected with measles? Doesn't that just make you feel horror? Now, why would that be? It's because of what you've heard and what you've read. Because after a vaccine is invented, there tends to be lots of reports of the bad things that can happen, like chicken pox, which anyone my age would have had chicken pox. But we're told in America that, that this is a very dangerous disease and people are dying of secondary staph infections. But problem is that doctors often give antibiotics and fever reducers to these problems, and that makes everything worse. I had another thought before I get to your question, which is that you had measles, you have 75 years worth of immunity. I was vaccinated. I probably don't have immunity to measles right now. So I am potentially more of a threat to the herd than you are. Okay, my babies would not be getting the advantage of my immunity. So my babies are more not only a threat to the herd immunity, but they're threatened by my lack of immunity. Your babies got much more immunity from your placenta, from your milk, and so they were protected by you and by real herd immunity. Now, as people your age are dying, older than you, of course, are dying, we're losing the true herd, and we're being replaced by these false herd. And so they're telling us now that we need to revaccinate. But for tetanus, this can't happen, and that's because we will never get rid of the spores in the environment, and I cannot give you tetanus, so it's not contagious from person to person. What was your question?
No, not a question.
No, it was a lady back there.
I just wanted to ask, I had the measles when I was a child, and it went very well. But then I came to hospital for something different later, and I there shared a room with a girl that was 17, and she had brain damage, and they said that was from measles. I just wanted to...
Yeah, well, see, measles has to be treated properly. That's part of the problem, is that, first of all, I would say, how many vaccines did that child have beforehand? I would say, did she get breastfed? I'd want to know that, because that's a huge deal when it comes to the development of our immunity. Breastfeeding not only helps the baby develop their immunity, but it makes you stronger even as an adult, okay? So, and I would want to know, did those doctors give that girl antibiotics when she had measles, which will basically disrupt the real immunity in the bowel because it napalms the bowel. And I would want to know if she got vitamin A and vitamin C. Now, those are things that I would ask of that person before I would automatically say that it was all because of a virus. Yeah, okay, I'm going to just keep going now because we can do the questions at the end. Okay, let's talk a little about the vaccine. I'm going to skip over a lot of these because I have about 150 slides. Okay, so I will tell you that I have a stack of medical literature papers of case reports of fully vaccinated people with very high antibody levels, or even just normal antibody levels, who developed tetanus disease, some of the worst kind of tetanus disease. So why could that happen? Well, I put this little picture in to show you, because what we have is, this is just an anatomical view, and on the outside, of course, you have skin. And so when that skin can be disrupted or dying pieces of skin, then tetanus bacteria loves to live in dead flesh. That's its favorite place to live, dead flesh with low oxygen. So if we have that happen, look, that we have, see, all these yellow things are nerves. See the yellow lines coming up? And they come up here, and they go into the central nervous system and up into the brain. And these red ones are arteries, and there should be blue ones in here too, but I guess it's not a complete drawing. But so there's veins and arteries. So everything travels in the same place, in the same direction. Nerve, artery, vein, lymphatics. They all always go together. So if tetanus toxin comes into the body and is generated in the body, and if it gets to the nerve before the blood gets to it, then it doesn't matter how high your antibody levels are. you can still have tetanus go up to the brain and either kill you or make you very sick. No, it doesn't matter how many times you've been vaccinated. So that's why wound care is the most important thing when it comes to preventing tetanus. Okay, so where does the vaccine come from? Well, I just told you that tetanus loves to live on dead flesh. And I think it's important before you give a vaccine to your child to learn where they all come from, because it's nothing like what I used to think, and so maybe it's not what you used to think, but I used to think that they just somehow magically got a piece of bacteria or a piece of virus and put it in some salt water and injected it into me, and that was it. But in order to make a vaccine, you have to mass produce the virus or the bacteria or whatever microbe makes the toxin, in this case, tetanus bacteria. So they have to find a way to mass produce this tetanus bacteria without oxygen. So they basically take a beef heart or a piece of, cow meat, and they combine it with pancreas from another animal to dissolve it and put these cells on plates and let them grow. They don't have to do it this way anymore, but probably everybody in this room who is an adult was vaccinated with this kind of a vaccine. Today they have the ability to make them using soy and using non-animal, but they don't necessarily. They still use this technique. So the vaccines are made on rotten meat, heart, and with pancreas juice, and then they also have to keep these cells alive, and you can't keep them alive with vegetable juice, unfortunately. You have to put blood on them, and so they will get cow blood and cow albumin and make special solutions to keep these cells alive while they're making the bacteria that makes the toxin. Then they take the toxin and they have to deactivate it so that it doesn't kill you when they inject you with it. So they do that using formaldehyde, and that's how we get that. So in the end, what we end up with is traces of mercury still in there, good dose of aluminium in order to make you respond to the very tiny inactivated toxin, and formaldehyde. And you would think that it was just nice and pure and that's all we have, but we don't. What we find from this paper here, even in 2014, is that they're reporting that not only is there a lot of variability from batch to batch, meaning non-homogeneous, but it contains proteins from the culture medium, from the bacteria, and from degradation products. Degradation would mean your rotten meat here. Just very tiny amounts. They'll show you it's just very teeny tiny amounts, and that we shouldn't worry about that. So moving right along, safety as far as vaccines go has a specific definition, and that is that we can only say it's safe in relation to the condition of you when you're given it. So in other words, you could have a disease that we don't know about, like an immunoglobulin deficiency or a cancer or a mitochondrial disease, and then you get this vaccine or genetic disorder, say, and then the vaccine can trigger problem, and then they will blame you because you had this pre-existing condition, and not necessarily is it a problem of the vaccine. So this is something you should know about, and also that most of the time, at least in the beginning of vaccine trials, that they're tested on healthy people, that if you have anemia or you've recently had a blood transfusion or you're on certain medications, they won't take you in a trial for vaccine, but they'll still offer you the vaccine later after it comes to market. We have 0 placebo, saline-controlled safety and efficacy, meaning does it work, trials on humans or primates for tetanus. The basis of effectiveness for tetanus is based on history. It's based on the history of disease during wars, which I'm going to talk about next, on guinea pig tests, and on many assumptions. So here's what happened between World War I and World War II. In World War I, there were a report of 70 cases. I believe this was within it's within a specific place. I believe this is United States data, okay? So we have 70 cases of tetanus World War I, 12 cases World War II. There were 500,000 wounds versus 3 million wounds. And so the rates were much higher during World War I than World War II. And we vaccinated our soldiers during World War II a lot. I mean, we vaccinated them when they enlisted. We vaccinated them every year. And we vaccinated them anytime they had a wound. So the assumption was that it must have been the vaccine that made everything better. So let's take a look at some of the data that we can find in prestigious medical journals, peer-reviewed medical journals. This one here in 1946 reported on European and African war campaigns of World War II. And they found that there was 22 cases in the vaccinated, 62 cases in the not vaccinated. But look at the death rate difference. There was an 87% death rate in those that were vaccinated and a 48% death rate in those that were not vaccinated. So again, what are we concerned about? The death rate or disease rate? I think we need to be concerned about both and be asking questions about both. But let's look at this. U.S. Army, World War II. There are 12 cases, and this paper shows you each case and how many times and when they were vaccinated. And of those 12 people, 7 of them were vaccinated. So why now? Let's go back to our world wars. World War I was fought using horses. The soldiers, the cavalry were a lot on horses. It was fought in areas of the world that it was lots of farmland, trenches, and so oftentimes the soldiers were covered in mud and water up to their hips. Medical care was not readily available to them, and antibiotics had not yet been invented. So there was a big difference in the stage, as we call it, between these two wars that would have put these soldiers at much higher risk to contract the bacteria and at susceptibility for developing disease from it. They're also, imagine the stress of being a soldier under those conditions. So World War II, they say, was a little more gentlemanly fought war in that there was less hand-to-hand combat. There were almost, I don't know how many horses, but there were nowhere near as many as there were in World War I. We had by then motor cars and tanks and boats as how some of the transportation occurred. And soldiers were not put into the same situation that they were in World War I. And we, at this point, had more medics on the field and better understanding of wound management. So I think we can't make the assumption that it was just the vaccine that made this big difference. Okay, I want to show you something I find interesting, and I'll tell you why. First off is that there are two branches of our immune system. Okay, so we don't have vaccines for every disease. We don't die from every disease. So we must have another ability to fight disease than just memory immunity, which is what vaccines are supposed to give you, is memory immunity in your blood. So you have a line of defense in your blood, cellular immunity, called innate immunity. And these are cells and some preformed antibodies, but they're non-specific, but they're cells that are ready to go on the attack. And then there's a branch of immunity called humoral immunity, and that has to do with antibody, which having preformed antibody. And what we find when we look at the response of these two arms of immunity after being vaccinated is that 15 to 18% of children do not respond via their cellular immune system. And 12 to 14 don't respond via their antibody system. And that when we look at all of the non-responders, we find around 39% had a deficiency in one or the other kind of response. I find this really interesting, especially when we think about herd immunity, right? Because we're told that the 3 or 5% of the population that's choosing to not vaccinate is putting the rest of the population at risk. But you can see here that for a disease that does have the potential to spread from person to person, that this group of people that was vaccinated is actually much higher, this group of people is much higher than the non-vaccinated children are. And because of the diseases like mumps or rubella, for instance, it's very common for children not to respond to the rubella vaccine. And if we have time, I'll show you the paper that talks about that. So it's not just the tetanus vaccines that children are not responding 100% or even close to 100%. We have another paper down here that talked about the fact that 95% of the population is vaccinated, but we're finding evidence of what they call protection only in the mid-80s, 80%. So these people are the kind of unknown non-immune, but that these people, we don't know that they're not immune, but they actually are not immune. We just assume they're immune. And that if they have a disease that looks like tetanus, they don't think it could be because they say they were vaccinated. So those are the people that don't respond. Now let's look at what can happen in children who do respond. Okay, so this study is important because what this scientist did is they, okay, I have to give you a little history, which is that there was a period of time recently where children in Africa were vaccinated for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, and the death rate among the vaccinated was much higher for other diseases. And so these doctors said, well, let's look at what happens on a genetic level after we vaccinate a series of children. So today we have the ability to look at these sensitive and sophisticated genetic responses after vaccination. And we're told that vaccines are kind of one size fits all, that we give the same vaccine to everybody, and that everybody will have a similar response, at least to for hopefully being protected against the target. But what we don't hear is what else happens in the rest of the body after a vaccine. And what we can see here is that each one of these is a different girl. There were 8 girls that were vaccinated, and they looked to see genetically what proteins started to be made, because genes make proteins, okay? So after any kind of an intervention or an ingestion, something like this, we can see certain genes becoming activated. And it was, to me, quite alarming to see the different activations that happened. And this is an actual chart from the article, but I broke down, made it a little simpler so we can read it better. But what we found is that there were what I refer to as epigenetic alterations, because it's not a gene mutation, okay? What it is, it's a gene activation. So while we used to think that our genes are our destiny, we now know that they're not our destiny, that only a small % of our genes dictates what happens to us. Our destiny is about what those genes are told to do. And what those genes are told to do has so much to do with what we're exposed to. So we know that, say, smoking, even eating rice can change your epigenetic profile. So any injection is sure to change the epigenetic profile. So what we find here is that and it happens by signaling, so think of the cell as a ball, and think of the genes on the inside of the ball. On the outside of the ball, there are around 2,000 receptors that respond to what's happening in the broth that cell is bathed in. So depending on what's hitting the outside of the cell, be it aluminium or formaldehyde or tetanus toxoid, we will see different signals go into the cell, and different instructions will be given to the genes, which will make protein. Okay, that's how it works. So we see epigenetic alterations resulting in upregulation of genes that are associated with genetic disorders, cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal disease, immunological disease, connective tissue disorders, developmental disorders. The list was very long, and these girls all responded differently to each other. And also you know, there are things called cytokines, which are chemicals in the blood that tell your cells how to respond during an infection. And they found that those cytokines were different in different girls as well. So there's a huge difference. If I was to vaccinate each one of you, the list of what genes would be upregulated would be different in each of you. So it's another thing to consider when taking a vaccine, even if the vaccine works, is that so many other things are being changed. Now, most of us seem to get away with this when we're vaccinated, but we don't have any studies looking at the difference between completely vaccinated versus completely not vaccinated and following out for 20, 30, 40 years. We need that. We could do that actually because there's a large portion of unvaccinated children in the United States, but our government does not prioritize or have any desire to do such a study. So at this point, we can't say for sure that the vaccines are causing these things, but we have now evidence that they could be, and we can't say that they're not causing them. And we know from toxicology that many of the chemicals that are in there are stirring up the immune system in ways that are not normal. And I'll get into that more in a bit. So this is another study that I will show you from 2008. This was a Swedish study. And they looked at infants after their diphtheria, tetanus, acellular pertussis vaccines. And polio, Hib. So these were babies, and they got their regular vaccines at 3 and 5 months. And then they took some of their blood out and they exposed it to the whooping cough toxin, which is basically what's in the vaccine, okay? And then they looked to see what happened 12 hours later on a genetic level. And what this doctor reported was 33 allergy-related genes were activated, 66 asthma genes were activated, 67 cancer genes were upregulated, and 25 immunological genes were upregulated. Okay, so we're definitely seeing on a genetic level some waking up. Now, whether or not it goes through completely and causes these diseases, no, it doesn't in everybody right then and there. But do we know that unless something comes along and shuts these down, what is the result? We don't know. The first study I showed you on the African girls, the conclusion is that the immunological explanation for the non-specific effects, which is what I'm talking about, of vaccines is not known at present.
Susan,
Time out?
I stopped you.
You stopped me. I'm too fast?
You're too full of information.
Oh.
And now it's break.
Okay, good.
And
Okay, break.